Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We are a father-son business podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems. And today we are joined by our new best friend from Nashville, because man, Nashville's a fun town to hang out in.
It's a great town.
Yeah, Zach Montroy, man. Zach, how you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on this show. Excited to chat with both of you today.
So I got to ask, are you the kind of guy that, like
Oh
most
boy.
of us, because I'm this kind of guy, that you live in a really cool place, but you only do the cool stuff when somebody comes to visit?
Actually, because of my wife, we actually get to Nashville usually about once a week. We live in one of the southern suburbs, Franklin. But on our date night every week, we try to get to a different restaurant. So we
Ooh.
avoid the place in Nashville where all the drunken bridesmaids, groomsmen parties are, but we try to check out the cool places to eat in town. So
That's cool. Good on y'all to do that, and double
yeah.
bonus point for the weekly date night. Uh, good,
Mm.
Miss Suzanne, if you're listening, because I have to say if, because she doesn't always. uh, Maybe we start that up. I don't know. We've only,
I don't got to bring up Miss Jessica because we do that, but she ain't listening.
yeah. That's right, folks.
Oh boy.
Yes, our wives are great supporters, just not great listeners. So we'll call them out.
My wife may listen, so I'm not saying anything. I'm
There you
gonna
go.
just assume
Okay, well,
Jackie is listening to this.
There you go. Play the safe card, Zach. That's always the great thing
Exactly.
to do.
Exactly.
Hey, man, speaking of safe card, I was doing my research, and there was a phrase that jumped out at me, uh, that was, kind of the, hey, talk to Zach about this. And I usually don't because I'm always off on some other tangent. But this one has stuck with me, and it's brave workplace. And I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by that phrase. So I'd love to hear what that means to you, and what it means to your team, your clients.
Yeah, that's a great question. And frankly, the way I was raised up in leadership was sort of just do as you were told. Be grateful to have a job. Just come do your work and leave. Check all of who you are at the door that we don't think belongs at the workplace, and just do your job. And what we know from a lot of research is, number one, you can't do that. We're, as human beings, we're wired for connection. We can't check who we are, parts of who we are at the door. And I think, when we really cultivate a workplace of belonging, when we cultivate a workplace where vulnerability is the norm, and vulnerability, I go back to Brene Brown's definition, is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's what we have to do every day as business leaders and business owners. When we can embrace vulnerability in a healthy way, we can really help cultivate courage and bravery in our work. No great innovation ever happened without courage. No great innovation ever happened without bravery. And I think when we as leaders can cultivate a place of belonging, a place of courage, we really start to get the best out of people. We get the best out of ourselves. And hopefully we've created a connected environment where we're really doing this together.
I love that the vulnerability. It made me think too, like right away when you talk about like high performing teams. Like sports is always the easy example, and you can think of like something like vulnerability, like a brave workplace. Like it can sound kind of to put into that bucket, like the foo-foo. Like all right, what does that really mean for like what the
Mhm.
team is doing? But when you go into a high performing team like a sports environment, they are vulnerable. It is the most vulnerable. You'll probably see a lot of those type of men that are those that are that vulnerable with what's going on with their emotions, those type of things. And that creates a level of trust inside of the team that you don't get otherwise. What in your experience, how do you take that trust and then build it out to that next level so it's not just there's sorry, that it exists in these smaller groups, more so without throughout the entire organization. Because a large organization, it's hard not to make the trust kind of almost clicky in some ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Cam. And, I think one thing that you just said there is, well, a lot of things that you just said there are worth reiterating. But one thing that I want to really hit home on is, you talk about sports teams. We've done a lot of work with first responders. We've done work with the military and armed forces. There is no act of courage. There is no act of bravery that we have ever seen that did not require a tremendous amount of vulnerability. We ask people that all the time. Give me an example of courage that did not require a great amount of vulnerability, and it doesn't exist. I don't, if you're on a sports team, if you're serving our military, if you are a first responder, if you're an ER physician. One of my best friends is an ER physician, and he's making hard calls every single day with his team. There's no act of courage that doesn't require a great deal of vulnerability. And, you just talked about, well, how does trust intersect with vulnerability? I think trust and vulnerability build off of one another. If I am waiting to extend trust to you until I see vulnerability, I'm going to be waiting all the time, right? I'm going to be waiting forever. Trust comes with vulnerability. Vulnerability comes with trust. It's sort of like rebuilding the Jenga tower, like it comes piece by piece. And in what you said there is very true, right? Trust comes through relationship. It comes in smaller groups. And if we're a part of a large organization, if we're a leader in a large organization, we really need to be doing everything that we can to help cultivate trust, to teach our managers, our leaders, our teams, how do we trust one another? What are the ways that we operationalize trust? And I love what John Gottman, who's just an amazing psychologist and has done, work over 40, 50 years on relationships. He says, every moment is either a moment to build trust or decay trust. There's no in between. So every interaction we have with people on our team, with our colleagues, is either a moment where we're building trust with them or we're decaying trust with them. And it's built in those small moments over time. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Do you think that like that clickiness that we're talking about, is that like a natural piece of the evolution for the organization? Like you have to have that to build the small pockets of trust. Then you can connect the small pockets, but it's like you almost have to go through that growing stage.
Tell me more about what you mean by clickiness.
Clickiness, and maybe it's because I'm thinking specifically of my college rugby team, so it's very clicky because they're college boys. But it's like you have the small groups where it's whether it's a connection through the work in some way, the sales team, the marketing team connecting over the work, or connecting the outside of the work. It's their hobbies, what they like to do for fun, those type of things. And because of that, you create there's this situation where you have high levels of trust inside of that small group, but it doesn't necessarily break out into the rest of the organization. To take like the rugby example, I could have 15 people on the field, and there's 3 groups of 5 that all, they die for each other, but there's not a connection between those 3 groups.
Sure. Yeah, I think yes. And I think that there's a great opportunity there, right? We see in the research that Gallup has done, we see even in the research that Patrick Lencioni and Jim Collins have done, you can have great pockets of culture within really toxic organizations. There's a large employer here in Franklin who is sort of known for being a very toxic employer. And I also know people who work there and have great teams because their teams have sort of been insulated from that. And I think the same can be true about trust. Although my challenge to any team there is, are we trying to drive connection at the cost of excluding other people? Because that's not belonging. That's not really trust. But let's say you've got sort of a team that you're working with. We have a great level of trust with one another. We, know how to be vulnerable with one another. And, we're sort of siloing ourselves to just this team. I would say that's a challenge to the leaders. That's a challenge to those teams to say, how do we extend this with other people, other departments? Because if we're just acting alone as a siloed group, we're obviously losing out on the capabilities of other parts of our organization because we're not working together. And what does that require? It requires a tremendous amount of vulnerability to say, hey, we've sort of created this like really great insular environment, and we know that we need to extend this if we're going to really create a place where we are going to be at our best. We're going to encourage people to be at our best. Like, we know we need to include other parts of the organization in this as well.
Yeah, the vulnerability thing, in all my years of leading various teams, is such a critical piece to establishing that trust. It's admitting that you're not the smartest one in the room, and accepting that fact, and taking that feedback, and hearing the rest of the team, and being part of the team, instead of being this person who is fictitiously above. In the Army, we would joke, and in some organizations, some places, rank has its privileges, right? And getting away from that spec. Excuse me. I was really wanted to jump back to the fact, because you touched on it early on, in being in that cycle of the standard of business, kind of the be thankful you have a job, you SOB, I fire you in a moment. How did you break out of that mindset? And what was jumping into my head was, whenever somebody describes that, as kind of the HBO show Mad Men, right? Because that's kind of the atypical thing that we all talk about in that situation, and the relationships within the office, and how they operated, and all those sort of things. How did you step out of that? Because that's can be a crushing place to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, vulnerably, it came, my first boss was that boss. And I mean, he even told us things like, sit in a higher chair than everyone else in the room or around you, so that people know that you are the leader. And I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, like, as a 20-year-old, like, if I have to sit in a higher chair to so people know I'm a leader, like that, there's something wrong with that. But I mean, okay, I guess you know what you're talking about. You're 30 years older than me. And it was, through that experience, and then moving on to another role, and I ended up getting paired with just an amazing mentor. I was promoted pretty early on in my 20s, probably way too early to be in the senior management role. So whoever made that decision probably needed some coaching too. But anyways, they got me a mentor, got me a coach. And I mean, I remember, kind of thinking as 23, 24-year-old, like, I'm really God's gift to leadership here. Like, I know what I'm doing. I know what's going on. And I've got more energy than most other people on this senior management team. So I could out hustle everyone. The problem was I didn't have the emotional intelligence to use that hustle to, a good advantage. And through some great coaching, really got humbled, let's say, and came to the realization pretty quickly that I wasn't God's gift to leadership, but had a lot of work to do there. And to really reframe, leadership is not about me. Leadership is about the people that I have the opportunity to serve, and seeing potential in them, seeing potential in what's going on, and really having the courage and vulnerability to develop that potential and continue to develop myself, because leadership is a lifelong learning journey, really.
Where do you, I mean, this is kind of broad, but where do you go for that resource? Now, I mean, because nowadays, and that's just such a great educational thing to share with everybody, whether it's, certain books or podcasts or whatever. Where do you go for your continuous leadership development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, you can see behind me, I've got quite a bit of books. So I would say I have a lot of mentors from afar. I love Jim Collins, Brene Brown, Patrick Lencioni, Adam Grant. Like, I'm an avid reader and learner from that perspective, but also, and I heard Brene Brown say this a number of years ago, I have never met a transformational leader who did not have a coach and or therapist by their side. So I've got a coach, I've got a therapist that I see regularly that challenge, encourage, hold me accountable. Because I think sometimes when you're in, a founder CEO position, it's easy to not hold yourself accountable or have people who hold you accountable. And so, in fostering an environment on my team where I want my team to hold me accountable, but also that I need to be held accountable by other people, I think is really important for us as leaders to have those people by our sides that are encouraging us, that are challenging us, that are teaching us, because we all have a lot to learn.
How do you, as you're going through this, whenever we talk about continuous improvement, I always come to this idea that I think it's a really important thing, obviously to strive for. But then there's also this thing that can come with it, which is when you're opening yourself up to, accountability. Is probably a better word for it, that you don't open yourself up as much. But what I'm thinking more is just the critique and the negativity that comes with finding ways to improve. In order to find ways to make yourself a better person, better leader, whatever it is, you've kind of got to look at yourself and be like, oh, I don't like that, I need to fix it. How did you build that pattern in a way that didn't open up to that much negativity? Or if you have to open up to it, how did you deal with that moving forward?
Well, Kim, that is a very big subject, and one that I don't know that we'll have all the time in the world to get into, but such a great and pivotal question. And the reason I would say you need a coach and therapist to work through,
Yeah.
because, and my wife is a clinical therapist, and so we're a house. Everyone has a therapist in our house, but we have to, I think, as humans, come to the realization that we are enough. I'm enough. I am not going to put my view of myself in the hands of somebody else. And at the same time, I have to be open to and interested in feedback, in getting better and learning from and growing from things that I do well, things that I don't do well. And so there's I think all great learning comes from paradox, and that's a paradox, right? Like, I am enough, and at the same time I have learning and growing to do, and I am not going to put who I am in the hands of other people. I did that for a lot of years, and that looks like hustle, that looks like perfectionism, that looks like striving for something that you'll never attain. And also at the same time, we have to be careful about who we are open to taking feedback from. I think for many of us, we've gotten really used to taking feedback from the cheap seats. And people who sit in the cheap seats are never once going to step into the hard work. That Roosevelt calls that the arena. They're not going to step into that arena. They don't have the courage to step into it. And frankly, I am not open to or interested in your feedback if you're not also willing to get in the arena, get yourself dirty, and wipe off the dust and sweat and blood that he talks about in that quote. But for all of us, we have a support section in our proverbial arena, and I think it's really, really important to know who those people are, to invest in them, and also that we are reciprocally investing in one another, that we're encouraging, that we're challenging, in there, obviously finding ways to improve, and also that encouragement piece has to be there all at the same time.
So I've by the way, that whole thing, and I'm glad you dove into that, of trusting the right people, because I've discussed this with many clients about the whole thing, but particularly my service members, the guys taking the uniform off, who believe that, well, what if so and so? What will so and so think about what I'm saying I want to do when I get out of the Army, and that whole thing. And it's really kind of a funny thing. Ironic is probably the better word. The ironic nature of it, because they never even ask the guy what they think.
They're just telling themselves a story about what they think the person is thinking. Yeah.
Oh yeah. They tell
That's
themselves
dangerous.
that story, and so then they go do what they think other people want them to do, and it's such a limiting belief that I think we all deal with, because there are those people that you respect and you want to ask their opinion and get their input, and they are the right people, but then we're not, back to vulnerability, we're not willing to be vulnerable enough to admit that, hey, Sergeant Major Smith, retired Sergeant Major Smith, what do you think about this, and this? And if I went and explored that, they would rather just sit back and go, because I say they, including Otis, sit back and go, he's going to think this is stupid. What kind of loser, stupid, harebrained idea are you dealing with? Could you share a story of either personal or even a client one where you've gone through that journey to overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what you just said there is so pivotal. As leaders, like, there's a lot of fear involved in what we do. And the most courageous leaders, we tell our kids this, we 10, 9, and 6-year-old, you can be brave and afraid all at the same time. It isn't fear that gets in the way of courage. It's vulnerability that gets in the fear of vulnerability. I'm not willing to be vulnerable. That gets in the way of that. And, it's so interesting that we use, we tell ourselves a story, and, our brains are wired for story. They're wired for sense making. And so, I think Otis is going to think this of me. And so I'm not going to do this thing, even though I don't have the courage to actually have the conversation with him, because I'm using all these fake data points. My brain is happy. It releases all of the, good chemicals. Brain's great, have a story, even though, 95% of that story is completely made up. We do that to ourselves all day, every day. And in fact, in organizations, that's happening all day, every day, because we don't have the courage and vulnerability to have the conversation. We're just making up stories. You can't make progress in that area. I'll tell you, for me, it was, at the end of last year, beginning of this year, made the decision to start my own company. And, I've worked inside of organizations for my entire life. I, worked as a COO and kind of moved up through the ranks of doing that. And then, took the vulnerable step of being a consultant and kind of going into a commission only based job, which, for me took a lot of vulnerability, and have always felt this entrepreneurial sort of spirit, and always kind of thought, well, that's just going to be best utilized within an organization. And, for me, last year was really sort of a Popeye moment year. That line of, I've had all I can stands, I can't stands no more. And for me, it was, am I going to be willing and courageous enough to create an organization that, from the inside, our internal ways and methodologies and practices matched what we were teaching companies to do, that we could do this together, that we could step inside of organizations and really help drive change from the inside. And so for me, it was the vulnerability of having conversations with some really wise mentors who the story I was telling myself, they were going to say, like, you are absolutely nuts. You are making a really good living. You got a young family at home. Like, stop being dissatisfied and just be okay with, what you're doing right now. And so it was easy to just say, like, I know they're going to think this is stupid, so I'm just not going to have the conversation, and I'll just kind of shove this down further and wait, X number of years. But actually having those conversations, being courageous, and then kind of taking the leap to do that was really all part of that story of vulnerability and courage for me.
Could you talk a little bit about when I'm going back into like the healthy teams and the vulnerability inside of the teams there, it was making me think of, when we talk like the vulnerability, it's like, what do those hangups look like in those smaller scale situations that we're talking about? When we talk leaders, it's like, okay, the assumption of making this big change, what are these different people are going to think of me? Could you give us an example on like that smaller scale of just a team member who's worried to share a good idea or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it all the time. It's, the leader wants to share first, wants to, get everyone on board with his or her idea. And what they unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, do is railroad over others' ideas, or they create an environment of fear or an environment of shame that really communicates this message that you're not safe to communicate, or you're not safe to make a risk or put yourself out there or to say you don't know. And so what ends up happening is back channeling. What ends up happening is covering stuff up, making mistakes, not taking risks, and frankly, not growing, because you can't create an environment that fosters growth without that vulnerability. It takes risk. It takes, leaning into uncertainty and saying, as a senior leader, I don't know. We recently had an event and got done with it, and we were, I mean, minutes off of the event, and I said to my team, and it was my idea, I drove it, I thought it was a great idea, um, and I was like, that was a complete and utter failure. And they're like, oh no, it's good, it's fine, you did a good job. And I'm like, no, it was a complete failure, and that is like a great thing that we know at this point so quickly, that was a complete and utter failure. So what do we learn from this, and how do we make this better? Do we completely pivot? What do we do with this? Like, what learnings can we take forward from this? But I mean, I had to, number one, recognize it was a failure, and then verbally articulate that, and then say, like, awesome, we failed. What do we learn from this? What do we take forward from this point? Because there really was nothing that went well about this event, this particular event for us. And it would have, I would just be making crap up if I was to pretend otherwise.
Let me ask you something about that since you brought it up, because I find it really interesting, and kind of dive into it a bit more if you're willing to share. If your team said, "Hey, it was all good there, boss," and you were like, "No, it wasn't," what I was asking about is the fact that you came off the stage, let's say, at the end of the event, and said, "Man, this did not work. We screwed it all up. Didn't perform as expected." But your team came back and said, "Oh, no, boss, it was great." Were they rah-rahing, being yes men, or is there something else that was a dysfunction in your team that you realized looking at it?
I think all of those things could be true. We're a newer team, and so trust vulnerability takes time. And so, I could just tell by the, like, oh no, like looking down, like you did good. Like, it was like, there's stuff that we can learn. It was okay. It was better. And I was like, that is a bunch of shit. Like, that is chicken shit at this point. Like, this did not go well. It was a bad idea. We're just going to be honest about that, and let's talk about what we do from here. And they were like, okay, good. It was sort of like they needed the permission to not, we call it the shit sandwich, which we absolutely should never do. I don't know that there was much that they could have put on the ends of that to make it better, but they were trying. They were trying to be nice. But I do think that as a newer team, that really set the stage for us to go, like, all right, how'd that go? Was it worth it? Was it not? What went well? Like, we're just really used to asking the honest questions from one another. But I think the best part of that is that we know when we are giving encouragement, when we are, really telling someone what they did very, very well, that they know that that's not, there's not, we're not just trying to be fake nice there. We really do mean that, because I'm not trying to couch critical feedback in nicety.
I love that. And there's a piece there that, we kind of touched on in a few of these different conversations so far. But it's about, like, accepting that risk. And, as a manager, as the leader, accepting the risk of what the way I put it in my notes there is just like the risk of freedom of your team, of like being willing to give them that room to go screw up, like a kid, go out and let him scuff his knee on the driveway and then come back in and, him with the hydrogen peroxide, know that it'll be okay, but you have to let them have some of those failures in order to move forward. What do you think is the biggest barrier to managers accepting that risk? Because we see it a lot with just like the work from home and hours and those type of things. Like I've seen with a lot of friends who it's like they have a boss who it's like, yeah, you can take all the time off you need, and then it's like, but I need to check every single thing you're doing. It's like, all right, there's not that level of trust that you think is there. Why do those managers hold back from it?
Yeah, man, you're asking some big, deep questions. My diagnosis at that point would be that there's probably a major ego problem, right? If I can't loosen control, or maybe in addition, you're hiring the wrong people. If you can't trust them to do a job, if you can't trust them, once you've trained them, you're creating sort of this like safe container for them to function in, that you can't, trust them, hold them accountable to do a job, then you probably have the wrong people, or you're hiring the wrong people, and or you have an ego problem, or you're not prioritizing your time well, right? And that whole teach a man to fish analogy, I think, is very, very true. I think as leaders, there's a tremendous amount of trust I have to place in our consultants, because they are digging into deep stuff with our clients. And whenever I bring a new consultant on our team, I spend a great amount of time with that person, observing them and really just being on the sidelines for them. And oftentimes that looks like I'm sitting in an all-day session with one of our coaches who's leading point on it. And frankly, for the only reason sometimes of just saying like, I'm going to be here because, as a consultant, we've all been in those really terrible situations where something comes up in the room and you don't really know how to navigate it and it just gets really messy. Listen, I'm going to be here and I'll tap in if you tap me in. And I'm probably going to challenge you in that moment, because I think and trust that you can actually handle it. But I'm going to be sitting here in this seat so that if you do need to tap me in for a minute or an hour, I'm here to do that for you. And we're going to have a real good, honest conversation about the day and what went well. And, how did you think things went? But what does that require from me? It requires time. And it also requires, I think for me, like, I don't need to be front and center. I don't need to be the one that is, the person that our clients are seeing as like the guru in the room or whatever. Like, I want them to be building that trust with the coach that's going to be on their account.
I, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting talking about like the ego there. It goes back to what you were talking about, your own personal growth of like learning that emotional intelligence. And do you think it's because the ego there, it also seems to me like it's almost the bar for management has gotten higher. If we were in a factory and I just had to make sure that everyone was sitting there making their widgets all day, yeah, that bar to entry on that is pretty low. We're at a point where we're talking about, having that level of emotional intelligence there. I guess to try to make that into a question a little bit, with that emotional intelligence, do you think there's something that needs to be changed in the way that we look at the management, or is that just being good at it? Like it's like we're saying, create a barrier to entry for it, but it's like, no, it's just called being good at your job, being intelligent, not having that ego as a leader.
Yeah, I think if we were to put it simply, it really is shifting the idea that leadership is about us to leadership is about service to others, is about service to the people that are entrusted to our care. Because you can't serve. I don't think you can really serve others with compassion and empathy and challenge and accountability if it's about you. And I think that there's been a lot of narcissistic people who are in leadership positions, and I would, I'm careful to use my words there. I don't think that they're leaders. And I've, worked with C-suite leaders and our C-suite executives and not seen a leader anywhere. And, we were doing work with a defense contractor in Des Moines, Iowa, and on a warehouse floor was surrounded by leaders. So leadership is not about title or position. It really is about mindset. It's about learning. It's about growth. But it's at the core of it. It's about others. It's seeing that potential and having the courage to develop that potential. And Monique Shufik, who is the director of the London School of Economics, said in the past, work was about our hands, what we could get done. Right now, it's about our head, what we can think and, conjure up. In the future, it's going to be about heart. And I think we're even seeing that with like the prevalence of AI, and that's a whole big topic, but like it really is, we're making that shift. Like she was right a decade ago when she said that. Work and leadership is about the heart.
Yeah, I'm wondering, were you listening in on my whiskey words I was recording the other day? Because I said that we were, and Kevin and I were joking about it yesterday on our ops call, and that same thing of, leadership is not a title, and there's no such thing as a bad leader, because then they're not a leader if they're a bad leader, right? And there's a whole lot of philosophy in there, and Kevin and I were deep diving in that yesterday. Go. I mean, feel free to comment on that, because I had something else I want to talk about. But that's a really interesting point that I think people miss, because they talk about toxic leadership. They talk about bad leaders. I just don't think those two exist.
There are toxic people in positions of leadership is really the wording that we should use there. Because, I mean, going back to what I said there, I'm sure you've been in like the C-suites of companies, and you're like, I mean, I'm looking under desks for leaders here, and I don't see a leader anywhere. What is happening? It is not about title. It's not about position. It's not about pay. It really is about mindset, mentality, and, the investment that you're making in yourself and others. But it's scary that I think we've seen so many people be promoted to these positions, and, we don't see a leader anywhere.
Yeah. And I've seen it in the most structured hierarchical organization that's ever existed, the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm.
And that same thing is the dude who's the commander sometimes ain't really the leader.
So I think that in the Army example, we could start there for it, because I think it might be easier to tease this out. Is there something that is like a self-fulfilling prophecy type of mechanism that's in there? Like we talk about like sales that happens a lot. It's like just risk, and then the person just gets lucky all the way to the top. There's not actually necessarily that skill level there, because it's just, if you take the bigger risk and you happen to win, you move forward. Is there something like that we do inside of leadership? That I could say, you can start off with the Army. Maybe there's something there where it's like you're promoting up, you're promoting for the trait that eventually becomes the toxic leader.
Yeah, I'll just say one of the biggest problems with the U.S. military is the way we promote, because what do we as humans do is we see other people that look like us, and we're comfortable, and we believe, if we're not trained to look at it this way, and I'm going to throw this to you too in just a second, Zach, because I think this is a great aspect to look at it in the business side too. But we tend to promote guys to sit on the board, look at their records and their performance, say, wow, yeah, that's great, because they did just like me. Mm-hmm. And I really like them because they're a lot like me and they think like me. So I want to promote them. Mm-hmm. I have not seen that, in that structure, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the business structure of how people get promoted.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. It's the same. They look like me. They sound like me. They think like me. We like the same football team. So I'm going to hire them and promote them into positions of leadership because, like, I could be good friends. I mean, there's so much wrong with that. And frankly, we wonder why discrimination happens. I mean, case in point right there. All of that is discriminatory. And my wife worked in the school system for a lot of years, and it was the same thing, a little different. But it was, if the only way for you to make more money was for you to go get an educational leadership degree. They didn't really talk about leadership in those degree programs that I was familiar with. It was really more like, what laws do you need to be aware of, and like, what does test taking look like, and how do you fill out an employee evaluation? Like, okay, stamp, you're ready to be a principal of a school of, or superintendent of, dozens, hundreds, thousands of employees. Forget that we don't really know if you're a leader or not, but you were a really good teacher. that didn't, I saw so many great teachers become really terrible principals because it was the only way to move up. In a degree, and listen, I love learning, does not qualify you for a position of leadership. Yes, you need to learn. Yes, you need to be growing, but I think we really need to relook at what are those qualifications? How do we assess them? How do we make sure we're cultivating an environment of leading with emotional intelligence, Cam, as you were saying as well?
Do you think that like what we're talking about of like, promoting the wrong people and that type of thing, you guys gave two different examples there to bring it back into like just specifically leaders going up. Do you think it's that you have people who aren't very good leaders, aren't emotionally intelligent leaders, so they just don't select for that trait? They select for these other two that used to be really effective, going back to, the widgets and those type of things, that they're just selecting for the wrong traits because they're not necessarily that emotionally intelligent leader. To round this out into a diagnosis, would you agree with that, Zach?
I think it probably has, there's probably a more holistic, I think that's an element of it, certainly. I think oftentimes we have people who aren't leaders trying to hire leaders. That's problematic. We don't really know what to look for. And also, maybe this is controversial, maybe it isn't. If you're not willing to invest in your leaders, I mean, you're going to get what you pay for. So are we really investing in the people that we're putting into positions of leadership? And I mean, we an immense amount of our budget as a company goes to continued leadership training and development for our team, because that's what we do. If we are not willing to put our money where our mouth is, like, we shouldn't be doing this work. And I worked for a consultancy for years who spent $0 on development of team. Like, we had to pay for it ourselves. Like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think like it really is, there's a rounder picture there, like, and really a bigger view of, like, I think part of the reason, or some of the reasons, that we don't have great leaders in positions now.
Yeah, so true in that respect. One of the gifts gifts that the U.S. Army has given me was they invested. Big Army invested in all these leadership training schools. That's one of the greatest things that the U.S. military does. But you're 100% right. It is rare and far between that there are businesses that are saying, "All right, I'm going to promote you. Here's some training for you." And by the way, take some time to get this down and learn this. Take some time away from the office. Take some time in your 40-hour week to make yourself a better leader so that I promote you. Most of them are like, "Hey, guess what? You're getting promoted, Camden. We're going to make this effective tomorrow. You are now in charge of that line of the assembly plant."
What's funny is they'll buy you the book though, but then they'll up your work week and then say, "All right, well, you find your time to read the book."
Right. Yeah. You need to do that investment on your own time. That's not part of your 40 hours a week that you. Yeah. It's like, I mean, it's sort of like we're buying a Chevy Cavalier and expecting people to, perform like a Range Rover, like that. You're getting what you pay for there. Like, they're very different. I mean, they'll get you from point A to point B, but in a very different way.
But I'd be willing to bet a dude in Tennessee that could take that Chevy Cavalier and make it perform like.
I'm sure. Yeah, they'd like rise it up and all that kind of stuff. Put some fun LEDs, things on it. Yeah, I'm sure we could.
I wanted to touch on something because it's something I talk about with my soon to be veterans all the time, and that's in a leadership position, demonstrating that you contributed. In other words, there's a line or a balance even of, hey, look what my team did, and also I've led the team to do this. How do you teach that balance? Because you know what, if you're constantly saying, look what all these guys, look what my guys have done, and promote them, which I highly encourage. But there's also a little bit of that fine line of, I did this without being the narcissistic guy who's like, nah, they didn't do nothing. It was all my idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that there's an easy answer to that. I do think when we are humble and when we're focused on others and when we are healthy, when we're in a healthy place as leaders, I think we can see that in other people. Like I can see that you're leading your team well and, you're giving them credit for the results and what you're able to produce. I, can trust that you're leading them well. I can trust that you're focused on the right things, that you're developing leaders, that you're developing a culture of problem solving, without needing to take the credit all the time. And I see this a lot in teams in a really good way when I see leaders stepping in to take, the hit for things that aren't going well, and then talking about how their team members are, doing things really well or meeting expectations, exceeding expectations. And you can really just kind of tell in the way that they're talking, like you're leading them really well, and you're cultivating this, brave place to contribute. But because of your leadership, you've created this high performing team. And I think it really takes a keen sense of leadership to be able to see that in other people. But I get it, right? Like if I'm just giving credit to other people, there could be that scarcity mentality of like, well, they're going to think I'm doing nothing or I'm just sitting in my office all day long.
I think I just want to add, I think there's an interesting analogy that just came to mind for this, because it's like the team, when you ever look at like a team and a leader like that, you can't really, it's really difficult to tease out what's really going on in that. Like take like the easy sports example of like Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. Like the amount of speculation in that offseason about who was really great and the other one might not have even been good. Like not even like was he great? Like he might not even have been good. It might have just been this other guy. But it's because the team is constantly feeding into the leader's constantly feeding back in the team. Like I said, the analogy that popped into mind is it's like we go to Kenya, we look around the savannah there, and we see a cheetah running with a gazelle. And it's like, okay, was the gazelle making the cheetah faster or the cheetah making the gazelle faster? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, it's both. They're always going off each other. If you put them in a vacuum, neither one of them are going to be fast because they don't got a reason to be. And I think that's an important piece to look at that leadership component.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that is a great one. Camden, you must have been hanging out.
Don't be so surprised.
Well, I'm guessing Norman, our former producer, probably told you that one. That's all I got to say.
His mom came and told me it in Swahili, and
yeah, she did. I know she did. No, that's awesome. It just gets me thinking. My what I learned is an analogy, and being a kid who grew up watching Popeye. I love me some Popeye cartoons. What a great way of describing that Popeye moment. I can't take it anymore.
Yeah.
I never liked my spinach.
Then you pop the can of spinach, which I've never had spinach out of a can, but Popeye did, so it must be good.
Yep, and it made him strong. That dude had some forearms.
Absolutely.
I love my Popeye moment, man. That is awesome. Camden, how about you? What'd you learn?
Zach, you said this at one point in the middle of the show. All great learning comes from paradox, and that is such a profound but like simple thought. I feel like I've gone through so much of my development in leadership or philosophy to make it even broader, and it's like the amount of times you come to something where it's like it's this and it's also this, and you're like, okay, those two don't go together, and that's where life is lived, is between those two paradoxes. So I love that. All great learning comes from paradoxes.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And they can both be true, to throw it in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can't remember who said, somebody I was talking to the other day, we were talking about that. They can both be true. That's a powerful word. Yeah. Zach, how about you, man? What'd you learn?
Gosh, I learned a ton. I love that analogy, Cam, that you shared. And also I would say, Otis, for me as well, just that idea that you were sharing with, the soon to be veterans of, just those stories that we tell ourselves. I think like it's easy to think that happens to other people, but it happens in our minds all the time. And we have to get after those stories, and we have to have the courage to have those conversations with people that we value their mentorship and their advice and their wisdom, and likely like you're being a blessing to them by asking and letting them share. I think that's huge and such an important learning.
That's awesome. And yeah, I laugh about that every time I think about it, and how much I even what I'm doing now, and how I drug my feet and then called up a couple of those key people, and I just said, this is what I'm going to do, and actually asked them, and they went, dude, that is awesome. Yeah, you really should. Why did it take you so long to figure that? Like, well. So
love it.
That's such a great piece. Zach, how do folks find you, see what y'all got going on, learn more about that?
Absolutely. Intentioncollective.co is our website. We've got a free diagnostic tool to assess how things are going in your business, and offer a free 45-minute coaching call to follow up on that. But intentioncollective.co is where listeners can find us.
That's awesome. Would there be a restaurant recommendation for date nights in Nashville area?
We should probably do a blog on that, because there's a lot of good places to eat here for sure.
They're having spent a little time in Franklin and Nashville. I agree with you 100%. It's hard to choose.
It is. Yes. Yeah. You got a good different option every week. It's a great place.
Awesome, man. I tell you what, Zach, this has been a lot of fun, and we really appreciate your time hanging out with us today.
Thank you to both of you. I love your show. Great questions, challenging questions, but I really appreciate you having me on today. It was a privilege.
Awesome. Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to the Cam and Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guest, Zach Montroy, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass along to someone else so they can enjoy it too. Make sure to follow the Cam and Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button too. As always, the full archive of the episodes is available at www.camandotisshow.com. Thanks again. We'll see y'all next time.